Bom, boa tarde. Eu gostaria de, então, introduzir a nossa última palestrante, mas antes também agradecer a todos os palestrantes que aceitaram o nosso convite e, principalmente, por terem feito, acho que, contribuições tão significativas. Acho que esse é o 7º seminário que eu organizo no MASP e eu estou bem impressionada. Também aos moderadores por essa tarefa difícil, com tantas perguntas. Acho que todo mundo ficou feliz com a quantidade de perguntas, mas eu sei que também não é uma tarefa fácil. E também para todo mundo que deu da equipe de apoio do MASP, a Brenda, o Rodrigo, o Vinícius, o Jefferson, o Lucas, o Baby, o pessoal do audiovisual e os nossos tradutores, tanto da tradução simultânea quanto a nossa tradução em Libras, por terem também nos acompanhado aí nessa jornada, nesses 2 dias. Então, eu queria agora introduzir a nossa última conferência com a Deborah Willis, que é chefe de departamento de fotografia e imagem da Tisch School of the Arts, da Universidade de Nova York, NIU. Na universidade, a Deborah ministra cursos sobre fotografia e imagem, iconicidade e histórias culturais, visualizando o corpo negro, mulheres e gênero. Sua pesquisa examina histórias multifacetadas da fotografia, cultura visual, a história fotográfica da escravidão e emancipação, fotógrafas contemporâneas e beleza. A Deborah é autora dos livros Poison Beauty, African American Image from the 1890s to the Present, Invasion and Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, e Michelle Obama, The First Lady in Photographs. A Deborah também foi curadora das exposições Reflection in Black, de 2002, e New World Africans, em 1985. Então, Deborah, por favor.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be introduced in Portuguese. And thank you, MASP, for organizing this wonderful event. Andre and Luiza, Adriano and Lily and Maria, it's really a pleasure to be here, and also to be here with my colleagues who spoke yesterday and today. So my talk is about Black humanity, and that's a central part of my interest in photography. But I'd like to explore today a number of images that I've researched over time. The way to think about photography for me is, for years I've been researching, teaching, and writing and making art about the African diaspora, and it's central to my work. After the announcement of photography's invention in 1839, photographers quickly turned, let me just go back to my first one. Photographers quickly turned their lenses on Black women as workers, labor, field workers, market women, nursemaids, and artist models. So this talk will look at this history of images, but also think about the images here in Brazil, the photographs of Mark Ferrez, Cristiano, Stahl, and Herschel. But also look at the beginning of photography here, as well as in the States as in France, starting with the daguerreotype as well from Louis Daguerre. So when I think about these works, I also want to walk through a narrative of visualizing a Black body, visualizing a history that has been really difficult to experience in some of the images that we've seen today, but also thinking about how Black bodies endured, how they viewed themselves from their children to the ways of seeing their bodies through fashion. How do we circumvent some of these images? And it's a way to think about new readings. So this first image here, it's just a wonderful pairing of 2 images. And it's an image of a Black woman who was a washerwoman. She worked for the Union Army during the Civil War. She's on the left. We see the sense of patriotism, the American flag pinned to her chest, and the U.S. brass button that's also there. But also in looking at Stahl's photograph of a woman who is, we know that it's used as a portrait for tourism, but it's also a reflection on her own style, the wrap of her head, the sense of adornment. And as we look at this experience, I'd like for us to think about images that have transformed our understanding of in visualizing slavery. So this is an Indian Ocean boat that was a ship that was a Dutch ship called Daphne. This is in the East Africans who were taken aboard the ship. They were illegal, during this was 1868, so it was the illegal slave traders, Arab illegal slave traders, had these young boys and men on the ship, and this Daphne, this other ship, happened by and picked up these young men and older men. But when you look at the emancipated, in terms of emaciated faces, the thinness, the hunger, the way that they're in the framing, and the way that they're posed, and just how do we reimagine this movement? How do we think about these young men, these young boys who were taken illegally after slavery had ended, but also the way that they're photographed? What stories are being told about this ship as we think about the numbers of Black bodies that were moved from Africa to the Americas? When Carrie Mae Weems is an artist, a contemporary artist, she has a project, From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. When she's looking at the history of images of Black people, but also this sense of looking in the mirror of history. How do we rethink history? And she says here, I looked and looked to see what terrified you. And that's that history of the images that Jeff showed today, the images that Rhoda showed yesterday, the images of brutality. Why was it necessary that she's asking that question as she looks in the mirror? Why was it necessary for you? What terrified you to see when you see the Black body? Why did you have to dehumanize that body? But she's also looking at that sense of beauty. She's reflecting on her own beauty. She's also reflecting on the quilts that are made. This is an antebellum dress, the style. It's very fashionable, Victorian, but it's also images that women made quilts. So she's honoring the work of women and women dressmakers. So this, to me, is a central piece in introducing the work of beauty within the framing of beauty of slavery. When looking at this project, J.T. Zealy was a photographer who was hired by Louis Agassiz, who we all know who was a scientist and who was interested in proving that Black people were inferior. So when he hired Zealy in South Carolina in the 1850s, and he visited a plantation and said that he wanted to prove his notion, his scientific study, that Black people were inferior, so he had a photographer make images. So this is part of this anthropological study of Black bodies. He also had the images with notes, Jack Driver from Guinea, plantation of B.F. Taylor, Esquire, in Columbia, South Carolina. So seeing that image is part of Carrie's experience of looking at the images, and images such as Jack, Renty, and Jack's daughter, Delia. So we see how bodies are becoming pornographic at the same time, that not only anthropological studies, but we see this as a pornographic study of the Black body and the brutality of that, the way that her dress is stripped from her breast, and we also see that the dress is still part of the framing. So we see that she's not naked, she's unclothed, and we see that framing within the understanding that this is the pornography of slavery and photography. Carrie Mae Weems created this piece. I'm not sure if you could see the images, and she's part of her series, and she says, you became a scientific study, a Negroid type, a photographic subject, and anthropological debate through the lens of Louis Agassiz and the photographs of J.T. Zeiley. Also, Agassiz hired Augusta Stahl to make photographs when he came to Brazil in the late 1860s, and to see, he created 4 types, Negro types. He lived in Recife and Rio, and isolated in terms of Stahl, looking at the images and trying to look at the different types of Black men. That Drana is photographed, and we see the central way of looking that Agassiz was interested in the breast of women, looking at their size of their breasts, but we can also see this is a woman who had children. We also see a way of reading her body as labor, a body as reproductive, but also with her dress exposed as part of the framing. Also working with the photographer Alberto Herschel in 1869, he also used the idea of the artist model. But we also know that on the back and the framing of this, that it's known that she was concubine, quote, his lover, but also thinking about the artist model. What do we see with the framing of her? The framing of her breasts, as again, we see the breast as a central focus of the camera. We also see the jewelry that she's wearing. That's a part of a recognition that she is owning her frame. But also the earring, her gaze back to us in this 21st century gaze, her hairstyle. But the sternness of her face and the beauty of her skin is framed within this idea of the artist model. We think of artist models through a number of images that Cristiano had created also for tourists. When we look at the idea of tourist photography, postcards, anthropological types, the range of images that traveled through Brazil as well as through the United States. Also that we saw earlier the runaway slave ad that was with the satchel on the back and etching. This frame is this photograph that's on the top of this ledger is a woman by the name of Dolly, and we like to think of, as opposed to a runaway slave, just a self-emancipated enslaved woman. So when it changed the language of runaway to self-emancipate, this says, ran away from the yard corner of Jackson and Broad Streets, Augusta, Georgia, on the Tuesday, April 7th, April 63. A woman by the name of Dolly, whose likeness is seen here. She's 30 years of age, light complexion, somewhat unhealthy, but rather good looking. She hesitates when spoken to. She's never changed her owner, and she was enticed off by some white man who was also a stranger to the city. So we read this language of Louis Manicolt, owner of Dolly. So we read the language of betrayal, as he says, owner of Dolly, that she was enticed off by some white man who see this kind of dangling of relationships, but also Dolly is underscored and she's in quotes. Dolly was special to him, as we see, $50 reward. We also see that she was photographed in a fancy studio with the back, you can see the back of the chair. Her head is wrapped, she's looking into the camera. 5 blacks self-emancipated from that plantation. Dolly was the only one who was never returned. So we can think about another way of reading Dolly's advance. Also, this is a contraband yard in South Carolina. We see different framing of women who were just recently freed. They are dressed, holding babies. They're moving from the plantation to a new life, unsure where they're going, but they're gathered in and photographed. This is also framing the work that Lily showed yesterday with the plantation of the coffee plantations, and to think about how images are framed, the workers, the dress, the idea of how placement, when we read this image and think about working and song and chants that are part of working in groups, that we can see that there's a relationship, the way that the photographer has created the landscape by idealizing a picturesque working situation, but also just to reimagine sound. As we see a pregnant woman working, we see women and men working in full dress. We also see baskets. And I think it's a really central way when you see the other image as we move forward, that the grass and baskets that are woven together that are very similar in South Carolina and in Georgia, as well as in the west coast of Africa, as well as here. And so we see how these baskets are central to connecting back to Africa, connecting back to the memory of what's the trading and part of that framing. We also see the head wrap that we can see with the first head wrap and to the head wrap of Dolly. These are other framing, and as Lily showed, the framing of the figure here, the white figure here, but then the way that the landscape is placed within the framing here. We see this geometric way of thinking about tourists traveling through Brazil who idealized the labor, the black labored body, but also the idea of a plantation. So this is part of that reading. We also see the stylized, this is on South Carolina, this is on the Hopkins plantation. This is planting sweet potatoes. But looking closely on the right, of course I don't use that red thing, but you'll see the basket. And you'll see a very similar basket. You'll see the children together, gathered together. We also see the women with the hoe. We see the head wrap. We see the gesture of labor, of work. This is a photograph by Henry Moore. And Henry Moore photographed also on another plantation in South Carolina. Again, as I read these images, I connect the images here in Brazil as well as in America, as in the United States, in thinking of their babies, black women holding their own babies, a rare scene in photographs. So rarely seen. We also see the white figure in the center, as we see in the coffee plantation, the figure who's standing. But we also see the head as a carrying, as Mary mentioned the other day about the carrying of the bucket or other types of objects on the head. So we see dress as central. We see the wrappings and also the way that they're on a cotton plantation. With the framing of these images, I'm thinking about the idea of work. It's really important as when I discovered these images and recognized that in America you rarely see black women with black babies. They're always with white babies in photographs. So it's a wonderful rediscovery of thinking about women. Even though we know this is a posed and framed image, there's a collaboration with not only with the photographer, but with the subject. And we know that it's important that the purchaser of the image is concerned about what stories are being told about tradeswomen, women who work in the marketplace, but also a woman who's also caring for her family. We see a pregnant woman, dress, we see different types of fabrics. As I mentioned earlier, head wrap, the adornment is really central as beauty. The images of women in selling their wares, from the shine, the clean, the framing, just to introduce work as beauty, but also the beauty of dress. And I think about dress as respectability, because when we look at Agassi's photograph, stripping the women to their breasts. And also thinking about Frederick Douglass when he writes about photography and looking at the central images, says the servant girl can now see a likeness of herself. The importance of photography, such as noble ladies and even royalty itself, could not purchase 50 years ago. But the idea that photography was accessible for working women. Women who were washerwomen, and we see the range of types of photographs of washerwomen, that, yes, they're occupational photographs, but also she's wearing glasses. So we see something about healthcare. We see something that's finding a way to humanize this subject. To see a woman here, her name is Nancy Goetsch, 1850, she was a washerwoman. And during the gold mining in California, many Americans on the East Coast and the West moved to the West Coast for gold mining. That she was able to buy her son's freedom, and her son is with the top hat. Brought her his wife, and was able to have a family with her. So we begin to see the importance of how women who were washerwomen, who were cooks, who actually were able to buy their own freedom and also buy their children's freedom. Another image of a washerwoman's Confederate, who worked for the Confederate States, but she's wearing a slave tag, that she's able to travel through to other plantations to wash because she's hired out. But it's important to read this because it says on the back that she is free to move around. She's enslaved, but she is a good cook, and she's good for sewing. But she's left her owner just to wash clothes. But she's also available to, and if she's issued food once, she's issued food for per day as she walks through. And so these are ways of reading how, of course, dehumanizing her because she's wearing a slave tag as a washerwoman, allowed to move through the streets, but then also the experience. And here's another photograph of two washerwomen with Union soldiers, but you see one wasn't able to stay still as long as it takes to have a photograph, and we see her body shakes and moves, and so you'll see a double image of it. And then another one, this is washerwomen in Suriname. And so the range that we see, the similarities of the photographers who are traveling and documenting the work of women. We see the same type of pans, we see the same type of posing, but I think it's central to look at styles. We think of hairstyles, we see dress, so we connect to parts of West Africa and their connection. So this is an image by a photographer who's looking at, it's a daguerreotype. We see Frederick Douglass is in this frame, and I'm going to try to do this little thingy. Pointer this is Frederick Douglass, and we know that he was an abolitionist, and he writes a lot about anti-slavery movement, and here is the Edmondson sisters, one here, this one here, that they're wearing, you can see how they're dressed. They're at an anti-slavery lecture. They are talking about their experience of enslavement, that they were about to leave Washington, D.C. They were moving north, and then they were, quote, captured by some slavers who wanted to take the two sisters to New Orleans and to hire them as sex workers. They were able to purchase, this group of people, plus her parents were able to purchase the two sisters, and they are now on the lecture circuit talking about the anti-slavery movement. Here are framings of Union soldiers, and this is Frederick Douglass, as he talks about the experience of working as Union soldiers, what it meant to join the Army, to fight for black man's freedom, to be a part of that. And these are some images of families, of a man who's photographed with his family, who joined to fight for his freedom, as well as other brothers and sisters and children. And we see this framing of importance The framing of the Camp William Penn, the only training for black soldiers during the 1860s. This is an 1863 photograph where 10,000 black men join the Union Army, and they were trained at Camp William Penn in Pennsylvania. That another photograph, an important image of a soldier, a Missouri soldier, the fact that he's using the backdrop to create, again, humanity. He's reading his hope of freedom. He has a pistol, he has a rifle, he has the American flag backdrop in the back. We see land, we see the hope as we read the image. Christian Fleetwood, another soldier, who also has written in a diary about his experience as a Union soldier. We, wake up at dawn. He's talking about what he ate for the day, the coldness of the night. It's raining. That Abraham Lincoln had visited the camp. So when we think about these stories that these young black soldiers were experiencing, this is an older photograph of the soldier who also won a Medal of Honor during the war. Another photograph of a woman by the name of Fanny Sturgis, who was formerly enslaved, and she's a wedding photograph with her husband. He's wearing his uniform. We also know that the importance of how do we make photographs? How do we think about images and posing for images and creating manhood? This is Emmett Adams. And in the framing of the image, the soldiers, the lieutenants, the white lieutenants who made these photographs, sent an album to their mother of all of the black soldiers in their troop. He says that this is a man who is loyal, that he is important to the company, he takes the notes, and he gathers the men. We can look how serious he is, his buckled jacket, his hat, his arms. And then the next image here. I love this image, James Roberts. And he was a freeman. The other man was enslaved and became free as a soldier. This young man, James Roberts, was freed when he joined the Army, and they said that he is difficult to manage, stubborn, as they described him. So he's described as someone, and then he also poses as, quote, difficult to manage. Hat tilted to the side, jacket open, legs open, just the leaning, the comportment of manhood. So he's creating his own identity within the framing. That images such as letters that are really significant. This is a letter by Jeremiah Asher to Abraham Lincoln, where he's asking, he wants black chaplains in the Union Army. So these images of emancipated slaves, we can see the range of skin colors to branded slaves, Wilson, and see the tortured of slavery. So these images were also sold as not only iconic images, but also tourist images, but also proof of the inhumanity of slavery. Learning, in terms of this part, learning is wealth. And this is the older man and younger children. We also see Gordon. We know Gordon through this image. Gordon, his back, scourged back, that the number of times that he was whipped during slavery, that he ran away from, self-emancipated, from the plantation in eastern Louisiana. And this is where he entered the camp. And he is wearing these clothes as he ran away. He covered his body with onions so that the dogs could not smell or find him while he ran away. And this is an image here, barefoot, entered in the camp. He was photographed by the surgeons. This photograph was used by the by the abolitionist movement to say that this is the brutality of slavery. We have to end this. But also it was used by the pro-slavery movement to say this is what happens if you run away. So this is the dualness of the photograph. There was an article in Harper's Weekly. We see here the three images. I have not seen the image of, on the right, of the soldier, of Gordon in his soldier's uniform. Other images, I thought just similar from this period as we found them. These are from the abolitionist movement and as they are now. Tattered clothes, dressed, ready for education as they're freed. Image of Harriet Tubman, who was known as a nurse and a spy. She led a number of Black people out of slavery. And this is a photograph by a Black photographer living in Cincinnati of a young woman who dressed as a boy who left Kentucky to Ohio, going to Wisconsin for freedom. And here I was appalled by the photograph when I first saw this image, that she has a gun to her head. But in reading the iconicity of soldiers and their photographs, the comportment of, they're holding the pistol to their breasts as bravery, so that they had moved this young woman, now she's dressed as a girl, to north, out of freedom, and now they're moving forward. So the photograph was taken as proof that she is free. And then we see dress. We see this image here of Cristiano. We see the draping and see dress as we see here in this other image with her hat, her shawl, and her skirt. The same type of dress when moving, going through the images in Brazil. And these framing of a woman by the name of Susie King, who was a nurse during the Civil War. She wrote a diary. This is a photograph also of Charlotte Fortin. During the war, she taught children who were recently freed and created a school for freed children. She lives in Philadelphia, and again, how Black people had to pose for photograph, to use certain types of imagery and objects to prove that they were intelligent. She had a book. So a book is a central way of reading that this is a person who could read, who was an intelligent person, and so that type of reading the image. That other images here, we see this photograph by Mark Ferrez in Bahia. Just a wonderful way of looking at, again, lace. We see the jewelry. We see her head wrap. We also see her leaning on the table, but looking away from the camera, but looking into another type of future. She understands what it means to pose for a photographer. She also understands what it means to dress and how we are seeing ourselves. And this also, Lily had talked about this image again, about work. The shoeless, the men carrying this young white woman. I'm going to move forward through images of working children who work in homes. We see the Black child in the home. We see also a young Black girl here, and I love the fact that we see her face. Is she compliant? Is she there? I'm a part of the family, but yes, I'm holding the baby. She's unidentified as always, as Mary had mentioned, but we also see the importance of her face, of her dress, and that the fact that her white owner photographed her to show that she's well taken care of, that she's dressed, she's not abused, and she's happy to be there, but we can see how her framing of it. We also see other images that are made. This is Thomas Easterly's photograph of a family, of an older woman, and could she resist and not being photographed? But again, the respect of the headdress. Children who worked as nursemaids. To this image here, a Suriname, and the framing of the Suriname ladies here, the way that they're dressed and the sense of adornment is an important way of thinking about how women are working within this frame, are working and also moving through different types of billfolds and moving through different types of family albums and knowing how these images are central to showing their trade. This is a Herschel image where she has a pipe, she has all of her fruit, she has the umbrella, so he creates a reimagined market woman and stand. Another image of a woman with yams. another woman who was photographed, also from Suriname, that we see, her name was Wilhelmina. She's 17 years old. We also see families that are departed, separated from their own, a black woman holding a white child in America, and the same with a black woman holding a white child here in Brazil. The range of religion and the experience, as mentioned earlier, about how do we identify religion in photographs. This is in 1863 of a, quote, slave church in Rockville, South Carolina. We also see on the left the two white figures who are listening to the preacher, taking notes to make sure that he's not exciting or inciting the black parishioners. But they're all at the altar. What story is being told, we don't know. But it's an important image to watch how that they are surveilled by the white figures. This is another image also of a Christian, as I was, the label of a Christian ceremony here in Brazil. So we see this sense of the circle. We see the framing of religion documented in these images. The stories of working women, the framing, and I love the posing of how do we tell the relationships of the framing and the playfulness of this artist pose. The hat, this is Cristiano's actually plate glass cart, that he's holding the cart of the glass plates and the negatives of Christiana. So we know that how the men worked for the photographers and carried their works. We also see the barber working in the studio, a studio portrait. We know it's framed, we know it's posed, but it also shows the work of men. We also saw the acts of grooming. We also see the making of baskets. We see the vendor, the flower vendor. We see the capoeira, the dance, the fight, the beginning of teaching a move of capoeira. So it's important to see how the photographs were used within the framing of tourism, but also with the framing of accepting the aspects of how these bodies were identified as well as seen in Brazil and work again, how they're carried. The fishermen. These are just range of images, and we think about the washerwomen. We also see how the images, the work placed on the lines above. And then the market women here in Brazil as they're photographed on a corner. So we think of the urban and the rural. We also see leaving the plantation during Civil War, the Rappahannock. And here is just one of the moments when we pause. We see a street scene in Atlanta, Georgia, where we see black bodies sold, auction, and Negro sales, as well with China. And so we see the black body as objects within the framing. And here is a Negro family leaving the Union lines. They're leaving with a ragged cart and with a horse, and how the photographs were sold. These are the backs of the stereographs that we see. We also see what happens when they leave, the hope of having a business. Here's a family, a man, Emancipation Day celebration, Abraham Lincoln's photographs there. We also see a woman in the doorway holding her baby. We see a young boy with a flag waving. So we begin to see how they imagine their freedom, owning a town. This is Pap Singleton, who moved, the Exodusters, who moved to Kansas. There's a black town called Nicodemus, and these are the first stores that were a part of their freedom as they began to see themselves as free men and women. And this is a photograph here leaving the plantation, and this is here in photograph here in Brazil. And as we know before from the other images, this is Emancipation Celebration and the signing. This is the Emancipation, also another large photograph of abolition of slavery. So we see that range. And I just wanted to also show the experience of Emancipation Day here in 1905 in Richmond, Virginia. So we see the crowds, the celebrations, and how people celebrate here as well as in America. So we see that dichotomy that happens with the experience. And then back to Stahl and the images of Black bodies, to just the ways of reading the Black bodies today, that we see a sense of beauty, we see children as they move forward, they're following, the way that it's photographed, we feel the sound, we feel the beauty and the range of it. So I'm going to flip through Stahl's image, but I wanted just to think about how we can see, these are all Stahl's images of Negro types, but we see these images that are part of that history of anthropology, but when we also see women who were spies during the Civil War, women who were cooks in the kitchens of their masters, who would slip notes to the Civil War soldiers, how they are posed for and framed, that there were games that were created for abolitionist movement, and we see these types of games that are played to teach children about abolitionist movement. We also see here that the Gone with the Wind was a movie. I wanted to end with this Gone with the Wind movie that was a popular movie that had a reimagined experience of slavery. That this is Hattie McDaniels as she prepares to play Mammy. Again, we see this. She won the first Black woman to receive an Academy Award. But we see how she used the iconicity of slavery in fashion, the head wrap, that she had to have a certain look, a look of sternness, not beautiful, but she changed that beauty within the framing when she replayed the role of Mammy. We see she has red lipstick on. We see that she subverted the role of Mammy. We see that her head is wrapped in the way that she's framing. So we begin to think about how actors had to play enslaved roles, but they also found ways to subvert the dehumanizing aspect of it. Here she's looking into the mirror, thinking of the mirror of framing that ugliness of Mammy that they had decided. But here she's putting on lipstick, she has jewelry. And then to just end with this image by the name of Molly Chestnut, a woman, and if the person who wrote, Margaret Mitchell, who wrote Gone with the Wind, could have imagined that a Black woman could be in partnership with her white owner. And here we see a woman who was in partnership with her white owner after slavery. And Molly, they owned a dairy farm, and they raised enough money for the two of them and their families to live into the 20th century. So we begin to just reimagine how stories can be retold if we tell the stories and look through the archives of women such as Molly Chestnut, who was enslaved, who after slavery went in partnership with her mistress and became a partner, full partner in the dairy farm. So I'd like to end with that and open up for questions.
Obrigada, Débora. A primeira pergunta que eu tenho, que também foi uma curiosidade minha, que é se você poderia especificar um pouco as fontes das fotografias e os acervos que você consultou na sua apresentação.
The range, okay. In terms of specific, are you saying you want the name of the photographer or the collections?
The collections.
So the collections range. The Schomburg Center, I worked at the Schomburg Center, the New York Public Library, for 13 years. And as a curator there, we collected a number of images by Herschel, Mark Ferrez, and So a lot of the small carts are part of the Schomburg collection. With the large plantation images, Lily shared the images with me when I was here a few years ago and had a chance to use those images. The other images are in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. There are images in other collections at the Smithsonian. So the range of collections are throughout, and also at the Peabody Library at Harvard University.
E essas imagens, elas estão acessíveis ou elas são mais para uma consulta acadêmica em geral?
No, it's for open to the public. They're open to the public. They're exhibitions that are central to like artists who are interested in rechanging the archive, just reimagining how the black body is presented.
Segunda pergunta. Se há uma linguagem corporal diferente nas fotos das black nannies, das mulheres negras carregando as crianças brancas, e nas fotos das mães negras que levam seus próprios filhos, que são mais raras. Você poderia falar dessas linguagens visuais e se há uma diferença?
I see the older women in the nanny images are very similar. There's a caring, there's a sense of protection, there's a sense of loving. With children who are holding white babies, they're just there. They're props. They're like vices. So they know that they're doing their job of holding a baby still for a photograph. But with the nannies who are holding the children, I see them holding with care. And I've looked through a number of them.
E também, terceira pergunta, qual seria a relação dos fotógrafos com os fotografados? Você falou um pouco da relação dos modelos, mas talvez pensar a relação mesmo no momento da fotografia, ou se havia uma relação antes. E eu acho que até poderia adicionar essa pergunta de que maneira também os fotografados acessavam as fotografias finais, se existiam.
So with the idea, the concept of the artist model, we know that Herschel, reading Herschel's story, and he had artist models, and this, I'm not sure of the subject's name. Do you know her name at all? Right. That she was definitely his concubine, but she was also a model. So she was compliant. Who knows if she was enslaved? Possibly. With the aspect of the Agassiz photographs that were hired by J.T. Zealy and Stahl, that these were, quote, anthropological studies. They were not artist types, and they were typed as othered. They were typed to be viewed as of subhuman, so they were not part of the, but I see that the subversive ways of the way that the men are posing, that they are posing looking directly into the camera. In America in the 1800s and during slavery, that black people could not look directly into white people's eyes. So if he was photographing, and so they would have to avert their eyes, and you can see they're looking off to the side. I'm not sure if that was a rule here in this country, but in that framing. So the artists, some were complicit in creating a biography of themselves for the photographer or creating a sense of self. Others, they were directed and posed, like the three images of the anthropological types, that they were told to turn to the back, turn to the right, and profile image. And so I think that they were part of being directed by the photographer.
E aí, bom, uma última pergunta, talvez penúltima. No Brasil, o fato de existirem soldados negros causou uma imensa polêmica e as imagens são basicamente escondidas. Nos Estados Unidos, elas são motivos de orgulho? Como explicar essa diferença?
They were hidden from us as well. So it's amazing to see that families. I worked at before the new African American Museum was developed. We tried to find images. White people did not believe that black people had a history, and so that for 20 years the museum had a long fight to prove that there was material culture for black people. And we found that families had photographs in their own collections. We also found that white families, like the soldiers, the 2 lieutenants who sent their photo albums of their black troops to their parents, that they preserved them. They sold them to collectors, and then there's the Library of Congress recently purchased a large collection of Civil War soldiers. So when we were in school, we only thought that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And to this day, people don't believe that they were black soldiers. So I'm working on a project reading the black Civil War soldier letters, that there were, I shared earlier, there were 9 black surgeons, people who studied medicine to work within the Civil War, that there were, like as another one, it was a chaplain. So there were men who were educated who wanted to join the army to fight for freedom. And so the photographs are hard to find, but now they're opening up more and more because of the interest of the Civil War.
Você acredita que os regimes visuais distintos existentes no Brasil escravista e nos Estados Unidos durante a Guerra Civil refletem diferentes formas de racismo e de segregação que se perpetuaram ao longo do século XIX e mesmo do século XX?
The range of images have perpetuated racism, yes. And I think that that's why we need to have a range. We need to know that there were photographers who opened their studios to enslave people on Friday afternoons. They sent advertisements that blacks could enter the studio between 2 and 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon, knowing that whites would not be in the studio. That black people who were enslaved, who worked outside of the home, paid for their photographs, and that they were able to have their own photographs. And white racist studio photographers know that they needed the money, so it was part of it. It was a business for them. So they made photographs. Sometimes they had clothing in there for blacks, but most of the time the people came with their own clothes.
Débora, muito obrigada.
Okay.
Acho que foi isso. Tinha mais perguntas, mas infelizmente o nosso tempo acabou e a gente vai ter que também liberar o auditório. Então, eu peço, por favor, quem quiser continuar a conversa, que a gente possa continuar lá fora. E muito obrigada mesmo. Obrigada também a todos os palestrantes mais uma vez e aqueles que ficaram até o final do nosso seminário.
Thank you, Luiza.